Hi, I'm Dr. Ashley Chin.
And I'm Dr. Alex Chin.
Welcome to our podcast, The Colors of Failure.
We're glad you're here with us today.
We've got a great conversation for you guys. We've talked today about meta-cognition, shame, emotions, the brain, and how it all connects to failure.
All right, why don't we dive right in?
Hi, everybody.
Hi, everyone.
We should start that over.
It's hard when you have to figure out a way in. So if we just kind of talk about, let's meta-analyze our way in, then we'll find our way in. And then I can delete it, and then no one will ever know.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
That's the hardest part of starting
So
a conversation.
The first minute or two should just be deleted.
Yeah, well, we're at 33 seconds, so we'll do that.
I do think we should probably intro it somehow. And we're back.
The way that I'd want to begin our second podcast is by looking at some of the things that we put together over the last week, and in the form of blog posts and just conversations that we've had, and kind of give everyone who's listening a review of that, because it gives us a good way to analyze everything. Last week we had put out a post just on really how cognitive ways that we can
cognitive distortions.
Yes, cognitive distortions, but ways that we can see certain things in our environment, or even have certain thoughts that and respond to them that in ways that are maybe outside of what our true values are. One way to think about like a cognitive distortion, and I wrote about it last week in Black or White Thinking, is that it kind of shades what we see and can push us, instead of being in the middle, can push us to extremes on either end. And so I think that's a really important concept as we talk about failure, because it's one way that we're driven to, again, acting in ways that are outside of our values.
Yeah. As just a little aside, like I really like metaphors. And I think when we think about the sort of extreme all or nothing or black or white thinking, I always sort of visualize like a pendulum swinging from one direction to the next. And I think sometimes, especially when we start to recognize like our own black and white thinking, it can be like our tendency to go from one extreme, to the next. And that can, I see that a lot with like clients that I work with in therapy. We sort of talk about like, okay, I've identified this problematic way of dealing with, something in my life. So I swing completely to the opposite direction. And sometimes that isn't, really what we're looking for. We're not looking for that extreme side of really anything, but really, looking to find kind of more balance or be somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, I guess I'm really curious about that. I can speak for myself. I recognize times where my own thinking, it's like, okay, it's on this side, on that side. But I wonder, like, for other people, is their experience the same? Like, as they're engaging in that process, do they perceive themselves as like, I was here, but now I'm all the way over here? Like, is that a conscious process, or is that something that just seems to happen?
Well, I think that is meta-cognition. I mean, what you're talking about is thinking about your thought patterns. And that is, I think sort of a purpose of this is to maybe, help understand what meta-cognition looks like. But yes, meta-cognition would be, really looking at the thought processes that we have, the emotional experiences that we have. And I mean, that's a lot of what we do. Therapy with patients is we take a meta approach and we kind of look at things from the outside in.
Yeah, I think that can be really hard too, because speaking personally, I think I do a pretty good job at lots of things that I try, right? And to have someone kind of say like, hey, maybe you need to rethink that, I think it's kind of it's a kick to the ego, right?
I don't know. It's an interesting experience because I feel like I am on the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of I don't always, I think, have that same level of confidence. And as I was writing my last blog post, which was on shame and the kind of shame gremlin, is really interesting. I think a lot of it, has to do with our, excuse me, I apologize for my voice today because I have a little bit of a cold. But I think a lot of it has to do with our experiences and our upbringing and just like our own personalities. I tend to be on the other side of the spectrum of like that perfectionistic, people-pleasing side. I think that can then therefore like increase self-doubt. It can increase, some of those things of like, well, I don't always know if, is my reality the right one? Like you said, like, is your reality or way of thinking about things the kind of one that aligns more with reality?
Yeah. So you're saying that I have a lot of thoughts that come up to that point. I think to lay them out so maybe I don't forget them is like the male to female to person perspective, right? Does one say gender over the other? Are we socialized to maybe be more responsive to other people's feedback versus say any other gender?
That'd be interesting.
Are there,
women are
yeah,
like socialized to be
yeah,
responsive to other people's.
yeah.
Oh, yeah, that'd be, yeah, I think that would be really interesting. I wonder if the research supports that. But like, yes, do women end up being like more highly attuned to other people's thoughts and perspectives on things?
Yeah.
Especially maybe when it comes to, our topic on like failure. I don't know.
Yeah, I know that.
Yes, probably.
So I'm thinking about that. There's a lot of back in the early 2000s. Janet Hyde, a researcher out of University of Wisconsin-Madison, she looked at gender differences, gender similarities, and developed the gender similarities, or I guess brought focus to the gender similarities hypothesis that, biologically we do have dimorphism, right? That our bodies are different, our brains are somewhat different, from male to female, and that is necessary in many ways. But I think the piece of like culture and society that as gender as a construct there, socialization, I think, has a lot to do with it. But, is that to say that like a dad could not raise a child any better than a mother? And if we kind of continue down that route of thinking or that line of thinking, like could a man be more open to, hey, I think you need to think about this differently than say a woman? And I think those are interesting ideas in therapy. I've talked a lot with people about how they were raised, and I do always suspect that there are probably familial beliefs and values and just the family culture that probably comes into play. But I'll be interested to know more, as we do interviews with people, to know more about like what their experiences are and start to build that up.
Yeah, I think gender, it's really interesting. I think it's one concept. We know gender is something that is socially constructed. It has a lot to do with, yes, family of origin and how, parents sort of adopt different gender roles. And there's so many pieces that go into that. But I think in terms of just like you asking some of those questions biologically, I think it's a very small part of the puzzle, but certainly interesting. And I think, too, it has to do with things like personality characteristics. Of course, like you mentioned, like, maybe nurturing, within parents, like males versus females. I think that, as just individual people, we all have different strengths. We all have different, places that we fall on those different spectrums. If you look at different personality characteristics or, the characteristics that go into what makes like a, an effective parent or someone who's a really effective business person or, whatever it is. I think that women and men can thrive in all domains, but it really boils down to like, not just our gender socialization and roles within that, like related to our upbringing, but I think also, personality and only so many other factors.
Yeah. And I think I'm just excited to kind of see where we get with all of this. Now, looking back at what I said before, I did forget where I was going to go in my comments.
We should have notes.
Yeah, I probably should have.
We're learning as we go, and this is a great example of what we're talking about, doing things imperfectly.
It's not a failure, though. I definitely didn't fail at that. And I'm not really open to any critical feedback on this.
Uh-oh.
Of course I am. I think maybe in addition to biology, gender, those sorts of things, I think, in terms of failure, I know, Ashley, you talked about in your post shame and the role shame can play in failure. I think one concept that I'd like for us to maybe do a deeper dive into is, that the role that like the brain plays, and secondary to that, maybe not secondary, but along the same lines as that is the role that emotion plays. Right. And I guess that I don't want to get too much into the realm of consciousness versus anatomical parts of the brain and where consciousness might exist or not exist in the brain. Are there microtubules that connect us to the rest of the universe? Or
I can tell you what my cognitive neuroscience professor told me in college.
Well, by cognitive neuroscience, you mean that consciousness is inherently in the brain.
She didn't believe that we had souls because we could not find them or observe them. It was a huge debate in my course. Oh my goodness, this was a graduate level.
Did she
class
fail
that I took.
A&P? Because we have two souls on the bottom of our feet.
There you go. That was good. We had a whole debate in this class. I took this as a senior at UF, and I remember obviously it stuck with me nearly 20 years later now, but I remember her saying that she didn't feel like consciousness or souls or, however we want to term it, was like something real that we really had, because it was something like unobservable in the brain, which, I don't know, a lot of the people in my course were just, including myself, were totally flabbergasted by. At the time, I was also taking numerous philosophy and religion courses to supplement, my degree in psychology. So I was just like floored that somebody who is a psychologist could, believe that we didn't have souls. But at the same time, like you're bringing up the neuroscience of it all. I think consciousness is a big topic to get into, and maybe that's, a conversation we have another time. But I love
that would be a big conversation.
That would be a big conversation. That would be a good one. I have
a lot of different thoughts on that, but maybe next time.
Maybe next time, yeah. Well, and I think, if we're going to talk about emotions, or, even just even if we're just talking about the emotional experience of shame, which I think is a really big one, I think that, that's a really big topic. And it kind of, I don't think it's necessarily the same conversation as consciousness and the brain. But I do think that there's a lot we can talk about when it comes to neuroscience, and how emotions play a role, and how all of this feeds into an experience of failure, or even just how we perceive our experiences, or looking at perceptions. So I wrote about shame and came up with this metaphor of the gremlin. So if you've ever seen Gremlins,
there's 3 movies, and I think there was a cartoon show.
Oh, wow. I don't think I knew all that. It's a silly movie. It's a silly reference. And that was kind of part of the metaphor. It's I remember watching it as a kid and feeling kind of scared about gremlins, but as an adult,
scary.
it's sort of
kind of gross looking. And,
they're sort of freaky, right? But, it's the whole idea that something so benign and so kind of cute, and sort of innocent looking can turn into something so brutal and scary and,
mischievous.
Mischievous. Yeah. And, if you think about the way our emotion mind, which, I use those DBT, dialectical behavior therapy.
Give anyone listening, let's give an overview of that concept.
Sure. So a dialectical behavior therapy is considered like a third wave cognitive behavioral therapy approach. It's something I received training in over a decade ago, but it's widely used. It's an evidence-based therapy approach for many different issues. It's something that's kind of the gold standard in our field right now for anyone who might be dealing with borderline personality disorder, self-injury, or self-harming behaviors. It's something that's really commonly used with folks with eating disorders, which is one of my specialty areas. It is used with addictions. Anyway, we don't have to get too much into the history of it all, but it's been around for a while. It was created by
Marshall Linehan.
Marshall Linehan, who's a psychologist in our field. And anyway, it's mindfulness based. So when we say like third wave CBT, that's what that basically means. Cognitive behavioral therapy has been probably the most extensively researched therapy approach in our field. And this was something that came after the creation of CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy. And it really utilizes mindfulness as kind of its base. And there's a few other therapy models that at other points we can go into. But
yeah, to jump in, mindfulness, and maybe to ask a question about it, because mindfulness has become more of a hot topic or a term that is used, whether in therapeutic realms, but also I think in just, talk outside of therapy.
Oh yeah.
Right. Becoming more mindful. Yeah. Buzzword. And I guess, give an overview. As a psychologist, what do you view mindfulness as?
Well, I look at mindfulness as having three components. And that's a good question because we have to kind of like break it down. What exactly does it even mean? It means being present. So being in the present moment, that's the first piece of it. And you're doing it intentionally, like you're doing it on purpose. You're practicing being in the moment. So that's the second piece. And then the third part of mindfulness is doing it without judgment. And that's probably the hardest part of it, but practicing non-judgment. And mindfulness, this concept of mindfulness is very secular in nature, but was derived. I mean, Marshall Linehan talks about it was derived from more Eastern philosophy, more, like Buddhist practice in terms of like meditation and mindfulness. But this is something that really, regardless of whatever your, spiritual practices or beliefs are, you can practice because it really is just about being in the moment, doing it on purpose with intention and practicing non-judgment, which is really just being able to be objective. And then, in DBT, we actually go through a lot more specifics. Like if you were in a DBT group or in a therapy session, you'd be going through a lot more specifics on how exactly to reach a state of non-judgment, because that's very challenging for most of us. We're socialized to judge.
And that's something that I think in first learning about it, I had a lot of hangups about.
Yeah.
that idea of like judgment. Well, if you're crossing a street, you have to judge when to go because there's cars or when it's safe or not.
Yeah. Well, judgment's a little bit of a different definition when it comes to this. So really, I mean,
so we need to be a little less singular and more plural in terms of looking at it. Yeah.
Yeah, because really in this case, we're talking more about, and the three ways basically that you practice mindfulness are through observation, descriptions, and participation. Those are the three kind of primary ways in DBT that we talk about how to be non-judgmental. When you observe, you're just labeling something, or actually observing isn't even labeling. Observing is just watching. If you're observing and you're practicing, okay, how do I be mindful in this situation? And you're using observation, you might just be looking at something and practicing just observing without a thought attached to it, which is, it's challenging. Descriptions are a little easier because when you describe something, you're just describing it as it is. My favorite example for this was always my supervisor at the time who I was learning this from. She would always use the example of like, the meat is bad. And that was a judgment and not a very good description because that could mean so many different things.
Yeah,
so if you look in the fridge,
and you smelly bad?
Exactly. That's what she would say.
Is it a bad
meat,
cut?
Yeah. Is the meat bad? Is it just like meat I don't like? Or did it actually
the meat
go bad?
Crime?
Exactly.
Criminal meat?
It has poor values and morals. No, it's
should we lock this meat up, say in the freezer?
But if you describe it, and you say, oh, it looks like it has something fuzzy growing on it, that would explain more about what's going on. Or if you just say, it is, you could just say like, oh, it's ham and I don't like ham. That is a description versus it's bad. And so, I mean, obviously that's kind of a silly little example, but like those are kind of the ways in which we start to apply some like skill to practicing something like mindfulness. I don't want to get too far off
That's okay.
topic,
I think
but
it's a good, it's something that resonates. And I think it, for me, I could see where this would maybe be a T-bone, if you will, into the car of failure and shame. But something I notice in my work is people talking about their feelings, right? Or an experience. It made me feel upset, or I felt upset, and
I am upset.
Well, and owning that, yeah. But something that I like to do is to say, okay, so upset's could be a heavy feeling, but I want us to be more specific, maybe in what that feeling could be, right? Upset. I was upset at this. Well, I was upset that I didn't win the lottery. Is that the same? I was upset when this person yelled at me. Is that the same? Right? Or I didn't feel good. Well, okay. So to not feel good, let's be more specific about that. And Ashley, I think what I'm hearing you say is like being able to be more specific with what is actually, like, to say like the meat was bad. That only carries us so far. Which I think kind of gets us into like a little bit. Okay, so this is the psychology nerds in us probably, but like ACT, right? Acceptance and commitment therapies. The idea that like language only carries us so far and only describes as much as it allows us to describe. But our experience of what is, of that emotion is probably deeper and more, I don't know if visceral is the right word, but maybe, that than what our language can describe.
Yeah, ACT is a great, so ACT, just to flesh it out a little bit for people, is also a third wave cognitive behavioral therapy. It's called acceptance and commitment therapy. And one of the things I love about ACT, I probably use this approach more in my practice than even DBT, which was, kind of the foundation for at least how I was taught to do therapy. But the reason I like it so much is it's rooted in relational frame theory. And
that's a big concept there.
Basically, we could spend an entire podcast on relational frame theory. It's fascinating, and it probably does actually connect a lot in with failure. But if you think about what relational frame, like what that even means, if you kind of think about, we all have these sort of framing, like the way we frame things in our mind, it's all rooted in like our relationships in many ways. We're again socialized to look at things through certain lenses. And so if you have a particular frame of reference for certain things that is connected in with your relationships and your socialization, then you're going to look at different situations through a particular lens, and everybody has their own unique way of looking at things. Yeah.
And that's how it crashes into failure.
Exactly. And language is a big part of that. Yes. Semantics and linguistics is actually the root of that particular framework. So anyway, that's a really interesting thing as well. But mindfulness and all of these approaches, they kind of really bank on people being able, kind of going back to that whole meta-cognition concept to like tie it all back in, is, we really have to be aware of what's going on in our mind and in our lives to make any kind of change. If we are going through things on autopilot, I can guarantee you won't make any change in your life, because if you aren't paying attention to what's happening, and a lot of us are on autopilot for many reasons, that's kind of the status quo for a lot of people, or kind of our MO. Like that's just the way we are kind of running through things. And so if we aren't too tuned in, if we're not like really attuned to what's going on, it's going to be really hard for us to make any kind of change. And if we're suffering, well, then it's kind of worse, because if we're suffering and we're not able to really attune to why or what's going on, and we can't really
and that's the point where we need the most change is
it's also the time when it's the hardest to make changes.
Well, and I think I read this interesting, but this might not be here or there, but I read an interesting post on Substack. Someone had written about, they had tried therapy for a while and ended it because they kind of left, and meta-analyzing their experience, they Like, well, therapy pointed out what I perceived as all of my failures and flaws, and I really didn't like spending week after week and the hundreds of dollars, for each session to really just talk about the things in my life that I would rather not talk about and make me feel bad.
Yeah.
And I get that. And I think that it is I'm not sure if that is everyone's experience. I really hope it's not, because I think therapy is a very valuable tool for people, who do want to change or who are struggling for whatever the issue is. But I do think that there is a perception, and even within our field, that we need to focus on the parts that are either perceived as broken or the parts that are not maybe not lined up, congruent, or at the same level as what we might culturally or societally say this is the right thing. And I think that's part of a bigger issue.
I have so many thoughts
on this idea of like, ABS, always be striving, or ABI, always be improving, right?
Yeah.
And that is, I'm going to use some coarse language here, but that's kind of a shitty way to have to go through life if we're always looking at this is not up to snuff and I need to make it better.
Yeah.
Versus, you know what? This may not be what it is that other people have, and I'm cool with that.
It's so interesting because, I have so many thoughts on that. I think that is connected to so much, like the stigma around therapy, right? That we're just in there to talk about everything that's bad.
And to be clear, we're not trying to push people to like, definitely do therapy. But
no,
I
it's
think
not for everyone.
About it, yeah.
And I think some people don't have good experiences with it for a number of reasons. I mean, I always tell people when I first get them on the phone, and actually have an initial conversation, like part of the first couple of sessions is just deciding if like we work well together or not. And it's okay if we don't. Not everybody fits or meshes with every therapist they meet.
That's an interesting failure point too.
Absolutely.
Right. Even as experience as a therapist, right?
Oh, yeah. I can even speak to my own. I've told you this before, but when I was looking for a therapist in grad school, I went to one therapist, like for my own therapy, and she took off her shoes and put her feet up on.
I remember that. Yes, I remember you telling me.
Up on the like table in between us, and then grilled me about my dad for like the whole session. And I walked out of there thinking, if this is what therapy is like, I don't think I'm coming back. And I didn't go back to her.
I'm making a joke here, but she was right. No, I'm kidding.
No, but you have to find somebody who's a good fit. And I'm sure she was a great therapist for many people, but not for me. I was very off-put by the shoes taking. I've never done that with my patients, taking my shoes off in sessions with them. But
she was comfortable.
I mean, it's fine. Looking back on it now, it might have been a different experience.
Did her feet smell?
But no, I think that it kind of speaks, to a lot of different pieces. I think, I don't want to lose my thought from before, but like, I think that the fit, is really a big part of it. And also too, I mean, like, yes, people believe that we are supposed to focus on just the negative things in therapy, that's what it's for. It's really just to always improve, or like you said, that kind of ABI, always be improving, like this idea of like, we always need to be striving for something better. I think that there's a lot of problems with that. If you go into it with this idea of like, things aren't good enough, that they always need to be better. Well, then that kind of challenges this idea of like, learning how to experience gratitude or learning how to accept what is. And that's actually one of the things that I think is, we brought up dialectical behavior therapy. The whole philosophy.
Radical acceptance.
Yeah, I was going to say the whole philosophy that dialectical behavior therapy is rooted in is dialectics, which is a philosophical model that two opposing truths can exist at the same time. And yes, radical acceptance is a really good example of that. And one of the best dialectics that I often use as an example in DBT is that of acceptance and change. That you can hold both at the same time. You can want to change things and you can work to accept what is. And radical acceptance is kind of the key to that. How do you actively accept what is without just acquiescing to whatever your reality is? and still strive for change, but in a way that is not just like, well, everything in my life is shit, and so I need to improve it.
That brings up, so I used to work a lot more with like families, but working with parents in particular with, say, like a teenager who might be engaging in behaviors that they don't approve of, working with the parents to be able to accept that something is happening without approving of that happening, right? And I think that's a difficult concept, especially for teenagers. They'll say, oh, my parent accepted, like they're not pushing back on it, so they must be okay with that. And I think learning that, like, that those may be separate truths, right? There may be two truths that are happening at the same time. They may be accepting that something is happening because, you know what, they love you and care about you. And they're maybe not approving of that.
They may still have other boundaries or limits or standards. That kind of goes back to this whole cognitive distortion of all or nothing or black and white thinking. Dialectics really challenges that, because if you're engaging in black or white thinking, it's all or nothing, right?
Yeah.
It's black or white. There's no middle ground. And dialectics really challenges that idea because it's all about the gray. It's being able to acknowledge that two opposite things can occur simultaneously, which for a lot of us feels so just unnatural,
uncomfortable, foreign,
very uncomfortable. Yeah. I mean, it's like if you've ever had the experience, I think about the experience of like, or the emotional experience of feeling like that bittersweet feeling, like when you feel both like maybe sad and joyful about something at the same time.
That's butterscotch, bittersweet. Is that,
bittersweet.
Would that be in a candy? No.
Like I think about when we moved from West Palm to Gainesville, it was so bittersweet. I was so excited for that move, and I'm so like thrilled to be living here, but it was hard to leave some parts of West Palm. It was hard to leave our friends. It was hard to leave some of our supports that we had there. It was hard to leave like our like mentoring professional relationships that we have.
Friends and the people that we got to know. Yeah.
Yeah, that was, it's bittersweet, right? Like it was so exciting and it was like, rooted in something really positive, but it was bittersweet at the sate time. It was challenging. So there was like a lot of emotions to hold.
Yeah, and exactly. I think that's exactly what you're getting to.
Yeah.
But that's a complex emotion, and I think that is, so the whole point of a cognitive distortion, right, of black or white thinking is to kind of simplify things. It makes it sort of a simple, this is what it is. And yeah, I think, to maybe bring us back to what we were talking about earlier, just the way that maybe the brain is going to work and our neuroanatomy works with that. But to make something simple, well, that helps us to decide. And I think the issue, if you read our post, right, what I think comes out of that is that when we're engaging in black or white thinking, yes, we can, the pendulum can be on one side. Okay, it's this or it's this, but one option can seem very appealing. And this is maybe not every time, because I think there are more difficult situations, but one is more appealing. And I think typically it's the one that leads to safety or success or more certainty, right? And the other is maybe perceived as threatening. And that then, well, we, things that are threatening, we kind of inherently, biologically, personality wise, in our own psychology, we want to avoid. Like, if we see a hole in the ground, a lot of us are going to be like, oh, I'm interested to know what's in that hole, but I don't really want to stick my hand or my head in that hole.
Yeah.
Right. We can,
for fear of danger.
Yeah. Now it's interesting because there are parts of the brain that are operating on, like when we have those interests and when that experience, right? So like when we become aware of something, when we are planning and trying to make a decision, right? Our frontal lobes, the prefrontal cortex, and our hippocampus are really kind of active, right? I don't want to say calling the shots, but because the rest of our brain is still doing something. But those are the parts of the brain that we're going to see if we were scanning at that time. Those are the parts of the brain lighting up because the frontal lobes are the part of the brain that are controlling our executive functioning, which is a bigger way of saying like doing the planning, understanding what the consequences of this action or decision might be, higher level or higher order thinking, such as if I do this, what will happen? Okay, if that happens, what will then happen? And being able to kind of anticipate and plan. The hippocampus then is involved in really memory. There's a couple other parts to it, but the hippocampus and the and the frontal lobes in combination are using what we have learned to say this is a potential outcome that could happen. Now, I want to say it's part of the temporal lobe, but our temporal lobe is the ACC, which keeps kind of our attention focused on
anterior cingulate cortex.
Yes, keeps our focus on whatever the issue is, like our awareness. So I can be walking around, I'll use that like hole in the ground example or a cave, right? I could be walking around this cave or I'm like, oh, I wonder what's in there. But then my frontal lobe will say, is that a good idea? Right. And the hippocampus says, well,
through.
Yeah, remember that time that you saw a bear go in there? Like, yeah, that happened. And the amygdala can kind of creep in and say, yeah, you felt kind of like scared about that. And then my frontal lobe will say, yeah, okay, that's not a good idea to go in there. The thing about when we have like these more long-standing issues, or when we have repeated issues that come up, well, our ability to then say, hey, I have a lot of energy to keep thinking about this, or I have a lot of ability to keep focused on this, that diminishes, right? Our ability to say, no, this isn't a good idea, diminishes, right? Our executive functioning may go down as we get more tired, or we get burnt out, or we get, just our focuses go elsewhere, or our thinking goes elsewhere. But the issue is the ACC may still be like focused on that issue. So our awareness of that goes down, right? So I come up to that cave and I'm like, so my ability to then say, I shouldn't go in there, or I shouldn't stick my hand in there, goes down.
Well, and I always think about it too, like, if we kind of go back to DBT and the brain states, right? You've got like, if we simplify it a lot, you have that emotion mind, reasonable mind, and wise mind. Wise mind is really a synthesis of the two other states, the emotion mind and reasonable mind. Obviously, it's not quite so simple in real life, as Alex is talking about. There's a lot of brain structures that are related to a lot of things that go into our thinking. But it's important, I think, to look at it from that simple term, because the emotion mind is really, it's like what we would call the reptilian brain. It's the part of us that's been around for so long. And it's
the limbic system.
Yeah, the limbic system. Yeah, the limbic system, which includes the amygdala, that houses our emotions. And our emotions are evolutionary in nature. Like there's a reason we have them. They keep us safe. Part of the reason we even have like a fear response, or, like that fight or flight. You've maybe heard about fight, flight, freeze. The reason we have that is because that's kept us safe. Like we're talking about threats, in our environment and the way the brain responds to them. Well, your limbic system, it has been conditioned and through evolution has been, sort of programmed to respond to those things in a really quick and immediate type of way to maintain our safety, to maintain our
It's been
evolution.
Adaptive.
Yes, it's been very adaptive. And that's why we have it. I mean, that's, our limbic system is very important. But then you've got that reasonable mind, and that's our cortex. And that's where the slower, higher order thinking is happening. And so when that goes offline, which it does for a number of reasons, it goes offline when we are threatened, goes offline when, we're met with like really intense emotional experiences. Which, going back to failure, like that can, when we feel like we failed at something.
Well, and shame too, as you wrote about.
Absolutely. Yeah. The cortex goes offline for those things. That higher order thinking is like.
And fatigue as well. And I think we can't forget the
basic needs are incredibly important.
Yeah.
You know,
the impact of like mental fatigue and just lack of self-care and how much that can impact us.
Nutrition is also really important in that. And yeah, absolutely. Like our physical health is very much related.
And that reminds me, we got to at some point talk about gremlins, which are different than gremlins, but gremlins are a fun topic.
Well, I think it's really pertinent to what we're talking about in terms of like how we approach failure, how we approach these different difficult experiences in our life, because we can know all these things. We can understand like, okay, I have a frontal lobe that does all these, higher order types of thinking. My frontal lobe really helps me with decision making, and it helps me to, in that reasonable mind place, it helps me to plan for things and set things up. But I will say we can know all that, and it almost doesn't make a difference because, it does in some sense.
Well, if we're asleep at the wheel, if we're on autopilot, our brain is going to take control, and it's going to do what it thinks is leading to survival.
Yeah.
And I think, so one concept that I have gravitated towards in our understanding of just our psychology, even in undergrad, we learned about what Descartes talking about the mind-body conundrum. Is the mind the same as our body, as our mind and our brain? Like, okay, so for years that has been sort of the example, but something that I think in, I'll say, last decade that has taken more traction is the idea that we have our body, our brain, and our mind, and those are together but separate. Right. And
what would be the difference between the brain and the mind?
Well, think about like a computer, right? And it doesn't matter if it's Apple PC or if you're on the fringe, like a Linux Red Hat user or something like that. It's all the same. But our brain essentially would be like the CPU, right? It's a part of the computer that controls all of the processes. It does all the calculations and all of the magic, if you will. The body would be the actual physical hardware, right? So we'll say, this will date me, but a modem, right? Like the modem would connect you to the internet. Okay. But a graphics card, would do processing. But then the mind would be like the operating system and the ability to have input there, right? So the operating system it kind of has an overlay of both the hardware and the CPU.
Interesting.
Yeah, right. And so as we think about it, like for myself, right, there is my body, there is my brain, and then there is Alex, who I perceive myself as, but also who I kind of operate as. And yes, I am at the whim of my body and brain. However, I also can impact and have control over my brain and my body. When we then start to separate out that my brain will have certain thoughts, my body will respond to that. That may or may not be a truth. It's just the way that my brain has been sort of taught and has responded, because the brain is both interactional and
interdependent.
Interdependent. And so, what we know from neuroanatomy and what we know from brain science is that like the neurogenesis will happen when we learn.
And neurogenesis is the creation of
new neuronal connections, essentially. And, it's kind of cool to watch like a neuron grow. It's like a root of a plant. And so if you watch that, you'll see it almost reaching out for connection.
And that happens when we're learning. That happens when we're having new experiences. It also happens when we're going through something very like potentially traumatic or something that is, again, related to these really intense emotional experiences like failure. Failure brings up so many different emotions for us that
and that's the part where
create these connections.
Yeah, I think when we experience failure, if we perceive failure as happening or in vivo even, I think that the amygdala lights up just nice and strong or nice and bright because it's very emotionally charged. And our ability, for many of us, to kind of objectively see what is in that moment may diminish. Now, it's not to say that it goes away, but for a lot of us, if we've been as we've been talking about, if we have these very deep experiences of failure that, well, we haven't gotten guidance on, or we haven't learned how to deal with differently or to accept, then yeah, we're going to respond to it as though this is a very dangerous and very bad thing.
Yeah.
And we're going to have that emotional response as opposed to like the whole brain response, or as opposed to, say, the mind separate of the brain and the body responding to it. And I want to be careful about, say, responding, not reacting.
Yeah.
Right. Because I think there is a difference there.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, we can kind of get locked in terms of our mind. If you think about us as our own individual selves and our experiences, one of the things I talked about, when I was writing about shame, and that I think about is that, we can kind of get locked in this like feedback loop sometimes with our thought processes. We kind of forget that our thinking can also be very subjective. So we feel like we're doing a lot of like logical thinking and rational thinking, but it's really just, it's occurring within our emotional mind, and it's happening like within the sort of amygdala. And we can get kind of trapped there. And it's one of the reasons therapy, or even just like verbal processing or journaling, or just like some way of doing that kind of, again, meta-analysis, meta-cognition, like there's utility in that, because being able to really kind of get into the reworking of that, the narrative piece of like how we are looking at things in our life, or how we are evaluating things, like we really need to kind of pull some of that outside of ourselves so we can look at like, am I doing this thinking from a higher order part of my brain, or is this thinking taking place in that place of fear? It's taking place in a place of subjectivity.
Yeah, and that's the interesting part. And what I like to explain about fear, anxiety, worry, we're not often aware of ourselves like moving into that place of fear, worry, or anxiety, right? But let's say as a challenge, right? The next time you feel really anxious about something, if anxiety is an issue or worry, tell yourself, I want to get out of this place right now. That's a lot harder than getting into that place, right? Because
I think first you have to acknowledge where you are. Again, kind of going back to that acceptance place.
But
because this is hard for people. This is really hard. And it sounds so easy. This is one of my favorite homework exercises that I give to my patients, because it sounds so simple, but it really is very challenging. If you're ever in the midst of a really intense emotion, like you're really worried about something, or you're really frustrated by something, or you're like really in it, to be able to label it and to say what I am feeling right now. Like we kind of talked about at the very beginning, like I'm feeling upset, which a lot of patients won't use that language. They won't use the I'm feeling upset. They'll say I am upset. They identify with the emotion because it feels like all of them, or I am angry, or I'm frustrated, or I'm sad. If you've got that, so there's a couple of things at play there. You've got that like attachment to that emotional experience, but then it's easy to see it in hindsight. It's a lot harder to see it in the moment.
Yeah.
And so if we can do that, if we can actually get to a place where we can not only change our relationship to the emotion, I'm recognizing it's a feeling and I'm going to state it as such. I am having the feeling of being upset.
Yeah. Separating yourself
from that.
Yes.
And again, meta-cognitive
work. And that's so hard though.
It's very hard.
And I think the brain and the body together, not like bullying, but they kind of team up, right? And like to make a long process to try to explain it in a short way, the brain the brain will signal there's a problem. It releases a bunch of hormones, cortisol, epinephrine or norepinephrine and adrenaline. And that keeps the body up and just kind of like focused on whatever the issue is, right? And then your heart's increased, your heart rate's increased, your breathing increases, you're like ready, as Ashley said, ready to fight, run away, or freeze. And that just keeps you in an elevated state. And those are the things that you are fighting against when it comes to, even in black or white thinking. Yeah, you're not maybe having a full-blown panic attack, but if your body and your brain is saying, hey, this is a problem and we need to find a solution, you're going to be ready to act on that. As opposed to looking at this from an objective way or a more rational way, saying, what are my options?
But then
what can I do?
Meet the paradox of objectivity is not something you can often reach in those moments. Yeah. And I will say, it's an interesting paradox because fighting against what's happening, which is sort of like the opposite of mindfulness, right? Being able to accept what is occurring and being present and being in the moment. That fighting, that pushing against what is, we fail at something, we mess up at something, and immediately what do? We want to avoid it. And we jump into, I wish this wasn't the case. I wish it was a different reality. I
would give anything to go back in time.
We just do everything we can to push it away. I don't want to deal with this. I can't stand
that's
this.
The ostrich effect.
Well, and it's the formula of suffering.
Yeah.
I mean, we could do a whole other podcast on this. We
so
might have to wait.
Are ostriches suffering? Is that what we're concluding here?
Well, when you are met with pain and you are not accepting of that, that is the formula for suffering.
Yeah, but pain hurts.
Equal or plus non-acceptance is suffering. And pain is a part of life. And that is a very difficult reality. And that's something that, really in doing this podcast and in doing this blog, not to be super depressing about it, truly, I mean, we have the opposite, desire, which is that, pain is a part of life. It doesn't have to be our entire experience. We don't have to suffer. We can normalize pain points for people. Everybody experiences, a failure. Everybody experiences pain. But what do we do with it? Do we run away from it? Do we bury our head in the ground like an ostrich and try to avoid it? Because I will tell you right now, that's what causes suffering. That's what causes people to come into our office.
Yeah, well, that's part of why I'm hopeful that through this podcast, through blogs, and just everything that we're going to do here to help make that not something that we immediately jump to, right?
Or get stuck in.
Yeah, get stuck in, and to kind of keep us to maybe close to an hour mark, I guess the big question then is, what are some of the ways that we can? Okay, so let's say we're in this place of black or white thinking, or we're feeling a lot of shame. What do we do? From what I'm hearing, it sounds like kind of not making an immediate reaction and jumping into whatever our brain or we might think is the best thing, but maybe taking a moment, acknowledging where we're at and what is happening, and expressing or trying to accept that. But I'm also hearing let's not keep it a secret, right?
No.
Let's
talk about it. Get it outside of yourself. I mean, even if it's not to another person, journaling, I think, is something that a lot of people are like, oh yeah, that's for kids, to write stuff down, or a lot of people don't do that anymore. I feel like because, we spend more time on our phones and on screens, but there is power in writing something out, getting it outside of you or saying it to another person. I
that's
think
so hard, right? But I think that's
it is
so
hard,
important.
But is it harder than keeping it inside of you and suffering in silence?
I think that's honestly, from a lot of the men that I've worked with, that is one of the dilemmas. A lot of these guys are really, really strong, right? And capable, and to kind of bury their head in the sand to something, or to repress it so deeply, suppress it, I guess, and to allow repression to happen.
Yeah.
That, or denial, right? That's just not an issue. I think that's where they find themselves. And
I bet it feels pretty threatening to have
of course,
acknowledge something like...
I mean, personally, I've never experienced that before, but no, I'm joking. But I think that's something that, for a lot of men, and again, round robin to where we maybe started out the hour, it is hard to acknowledge that, and maybe for that reason.
way of doing that more privately might be,
Of course.
a way to start, because even just, I think the experience of like acknowledging something to yourself can be healing if we're in that place of like denial, because even before you share it with somebody else and you get to a place where you can start to like challenge some of, if you're stuck in that shame cycle and you're like, oh my gosh, I need, if you're aware and you're at a point where you're like, I might be experiencing some shame, you can at that point actually go to someone and say like, is this real? Is the way I'm thinking about it, aligned with reality? And you might have, your partner or friend or somebody be like, no, I think you're fantastic. I think you're great. Like, I don't think you're a terrible human. But that might come a lot later. And we shouldn't always be kind of seeking reassurance, because that isn't necessarily healthy either.
As well.
But we need to sometimes just acknowledge things to ourselves. And I think that can be the first step, in some of these situations. I also would say if someone is stuck in an emotional state, stuck in a place where they feel like they've failed, there is power in just breathing through it too. And actually saying to yourself, I'm not going to push this away. I'm going to let this exist right now. As uncomfortable as it is, it's not going to kill me.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that aligns a lot with the first post that I did. I kind of ended by saying like, okay, so if you're in this place, find color, right? Do something that's other than focusing on whatever the perceived failure is, right? Get some distance from it and return another time, right? Let's get some objectivity. Okay, so we're coming up to the end of the hour. Just want to say thank you if you sat through all of this and you joined us for the hour. We greatly appreciate it. We're going to be putting out more content and more podcasts, more blogs. And so if there's ever any topics or anything that you would think like, hey, I'd really like to hear about this, or I'm interested in this, definitely let us know.
Please, yes.
If you're ever interested in knowing more about therapy too, you can definitely reach out and we can give you resources. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, if you did listen to this whole thing, oh my goodness, you're amazing. And thank you. We hope it was helpful. And yeah, please be on the lookout for more episodes, more blog posts, and we'll talk with you soon.